The lounge had quieted, but the air remained heavy with the aftershocks of what had just transpired. Eliza sat calmly in her corner, her composure unbroken, but beneath the serene surface, a storm of thoughts churned. She had faced moments like this many times in her life, moments where she had to stand her ground not just for herself, but for the countless others who shared her struggle. This wasn't just about a lounge or a rude guest. It was about something much larger. David, her assistant, sat beside her, his hand still trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Miss Barton," he said softly, his voice laced with concern, "are you okay?" Eliza turned her head toward him, her expression softening just enough to reassure him. "I'm fine, David," she said, her voice steady. "Moments like these are part of the journey." David nodded but didn't look convinced. "It shouldn't have to be like this," he muttered, his frustration evident. "You've built this airline from the ground up, and yet people still—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Eliza placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "People will always find ways to diminish what they don't understand," she said. "The key is not to let them succeed." As she spoke, her gaze drifted toward the bar area, where a small group of passengers whispered among themselves. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their curiosity mingled with shame. Some had looked away when the incident unfolded, unwilling to involve themselves, while others had watched with morbid fascination. Eliza had long stopped expecting bystanders to step in. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Mr. Harding returned, his expression a mix of contrition and determination. He held a tablet in one hand, the airline's logo gleaming on its surface. "Miss Barton," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "I've taken the liberty of drafting a report about what just happened. If you'd like, I can file it immediately, and we'll begin implementing measures to address the issues you raised." Eliza looked at him for a moment, her sharp eyes assessing. She could see that Harding meant well, but she also knew the limits of his perspective. He was a man who had likely never experienced the kind of scrutiny and prejudice she faced daily. Still, his willingness to act was a step in the right direction. "Let me see it," she said simply. Harding handed her the tablet, and Eliza began to read. The report was thorough, detailing the events with precision, but as she read, her lips pressed into a thin line. The language, though professional, lacked the emotional weight of what had truly happened. It described Susan's actions as inappropriate and the flight attendant's behavior as a lapse in judgment. Nowhere did it address the deeper issues at play. "This is a good start," Eliza said, setting the tablet down on the table. "But it's not enough." Harding frowned slightly, clearly caught off guard. "Not enough?" he repeated. Eliza leaned forward, her posture radiating authority. "This incident wasn't just about a misunderstanding," she said. "It was about systemic biases that allow people like Susan to feel entitled to police others, and about the implicit biases that made your staff doubt me without cause." Harding opened his mouth to respond, but Eliza held up a hand, stopping him. "If we're going to address this," she continued, "we need to go deeper. Diversity training isn't enough. We need to change the culture of this company from the ground up, starting with hiring practices and extending to how we train our employees to handle situations like this." Her words carried the weight of years of experience, and Harding seemed to shrink slightly under her gaze. "I understand," he said finally. "I'll revise the report and work with our HR team to develop a more comprehensive plan." Eliza nodded, satisfied for the moment. "Good. And make sure the plan includes regular evaluations to measure progress. This isn't a one-time fix. It's an ongoing commitment." Harding hesitated, then nodded again. "Of course, Miss Barton. I'll get started right away." As he turned to leave, Eliza's attention returned to the lounge. The group at the bar had dispersed, though a few stragglers lingered, their eyes flicking toward her before quickly looking away. Eliza ignored them. She had more important matters to focus on. David, who had been silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. "You handled that perfectly," he said, admiration evident in his voice. "I don't know how you stay so calm." Eliza allowed herself a small smile. "It's not about staying calm," she said. "It's about staying in control." Her words hung in the air, a quiet affirmation of the strength she had cultivated over years of challenges and triumphs. As she picked up her briefcase, preparing to head to her meeting, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Today had been a reminder of why she fought so hard to create spaces where everyone could feel seen and valued. But the day wasn't over yet. As Eliza rose from her seat, the sound of hurried footsteps reached her ears. She turned to see the young flight attendant approaching, her face pale but determined. "Miss Barton," the attendant said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to apologize again. What I did was wrong and I want to do better." Eliza regarded the woman carefully, her gaze searching for sincerity. She saw it in the attendant's eyes, the genuine regret, the desire to grow. Eliza nodded, her expression softening. "Apologies are important," she said, "but what matters most is what you do next. If you're truly committed to doing better, I expect to see you lead by example." The attendant nodded quickly, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Barton. I won't let you down." Eliza watched as the woman walked away, her steps lighter than before. Moments like these, small as they seemed, were what made the fight worth it. They were reminders that change was possible, even if it came one person at a time. As Eliza left the lounge, the weight of the day lifted slightly from her shoulders. She had faced prejudice and emerged stronger, as she always did. But more importantly, she had planted seeds of change, knowing that their growth would ripple far beyond this one moment. The airport lounge returned to its muted rhythm, but the atmosphere felt altered, charged with an unspoken awareness of what had just unfolded. Eliza exited the room with her assistant David by her side, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished marble floors. Yet, even as they moved toward the meeting that awaited her, Eliza could feel it, a lingering presence, like the weight of a storm that refused to pass. Susan. Eliza's instincts were rarely wrong. She had felt the simmering resentment in Susan's voice, the way entitlement clung to her words like a second skin. People like Susan didn't retreat quietly. They lashed out, desperate to reclaim the power they believed was theirs by right. Eliza glanced at David, whose brow was furrowed in thought, his hands clutching the tablet containing her upcoming presentation. "David," she said, her voice calm but firm, "stay close." David looked up, startled. "Of course, Miss Barton," he said, though the flicker of concern in his eyes suggested he understood her warning. They had barely reached the terminal's private elevator when the sound of hurried footsteps broke the steady hum of airport noise. Eliza didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Susan's voice, sharp and cutting, rang out like a blade. "Wait, you can't just walk away like that." Eliza exhaled silently, turning slowly to face her pursuer. Susan was storming toward her, her face flushed with indignation, her designer handbag swinging wildly from her arm. Her entire demeanor screamed affronted privilege, as if the world itself had wronged her by refusing to bow to her whims. "I didn't appreciate the way you humiliated me back there," Susan said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "You think you can just throw your title around and make me look like the bad guy? I was only doing what I thought was right." Eliza regarded her evenly, her expression unreadable. "What you thought was right," she repeated, her voice low and steady, "was making baseless assumptions about me. And when those assumptions were proven wrong, you doubled down instead of admitting your mistake." Susan bristled, her lips curling into a sneer. "Mistake? You were sitting there like you owned the place." "Oh wait, you do own the place, don't you?" She laughed bitterly, the sound grating. "Must be nice to play the victim while having everything handed to you on a silver platter." David stiffened, his hands tightening around the tablet, but Eliza placed a calming hand on his arm. "Don't," she murmured softly. She had dealt with this kind of vitriol before, and she knew how to handle it. Susan, emboldened by Eliza's silence, pressed on. "You know what I think? You're the one with the problem. You walk around acting superior, making everyone else feel small just to prove a point. Well, I'm not going to apologize for standing up for what's right." Eliza took a slow step forward, her gaze locking onto Susan's. Her movements were deliberate, her posture unyielding, and for the first time, Susan faltered, her bravado wavering under the weight of Eliza's presence. "You think you stood up for what's right?" Eliza asked, her voice calm but razor sharp. "What you stood up for was your own prejudice. You assumed I didn't belong because I didn't fit your narrow view of who deserves to occupy that space. And when you were confronted with the truth, instead of reflecting, you chose to double down on your ignorance." Susan opened her mouth to respond, but Eliza wasn't finished. "I've worked my entire life to get where I am. Nothing was handed to me. Every step I've taken has been earned through hard work, perseverance, and sacrifice. And people like you, people who weaponize their privilege to tear others down, are the reason I fight so hard to create spaces where everyone is valued." The terminal grew quieter, as if the very air had stilled to listen. Susan stared at Eliza, her expression twisting with a mix of anger and discomfort. For a moment, it seemed she might lash out again, but then her shoulders slumped, and she looked away. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she muttered, her voice barely audible. Eliza watched her carefully, searching for any sign of sincerity. "It's not about how far it went," she said. "It's about what you do next. If you truly regret what happened, you'll take this as an opportunity to reflect and change. But if you continue to justify your actions, you'll only repeat the same mistakes." Susan said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. Eliza waited a moment longer, then turned back to David. "Let's go," she said quietly. As they entered the private elevator, Eliza allowed herself a moment to breathe. She knew Susan's type too well to believe the issue was resolved, but she also knew that she couldn't carry the weight of changing everyone's heart. Her focus remained on the bigger picture, the policies, the culture, and the systems she could influence to ensure that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles. David, standing beside her, finally broke the silence. "Miss Barton," he said hesitantly, "do you think she'll learn anything from this?" Eliza's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "That's up to her," she said. "But whether she does or not, the work continues." The elevator doors slid open, revealing the sleek, modern conference room where Eliza's next meeting awaited. She stepped out with her head held high, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. Behind her, the echoes of Susan's confrontation lingered, a reminder of the fight that never truly ended, but also of the victories, however small, that made the struggle worthwhile. Eliza entered the sleek conference room, the coolness of the air conditioning brushing against her skin, a sharp contrast to the heated encounter she had just endured. The room was a marvel of modern architecture, glass walls offering a view of the bustling runway, a long mahogany table gleaming under the soft glow of recessed lighting, and plush chairs arranged with military precision. But none of it mattered to her at the moment. Her mind was still replaying Susan's words, each one a reminder of the work that remained to be done. David, her assistant, placed her tablet at the head of the table, his movements deliberate but tense. Eliza noticed the way his shoulders were drawn tight, the faint furrow of worry etched across his brow. He had always been a calm presence in her often chaotic world, but today, even he seemed shaken. "Take a breath, David," Eliza said softly, her voice a balm against the tension in the room. David paused, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and admiration. "How do you do it, Miss Barton?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "How do you stay so composed after everything?" Eliza moved to her seat at the head of the table, lowering herself with the grace of someone who had learned to wear resilience like armor. She rested her hands lightly on the table's smooth surface, her gold bracelet catching the light as she gestured for David to sit beside her. "Composure isn't about ignoring what you feel," she said. "It's about channeling it. Every time I face someone like Susan, every time I'm underestimated or judged, I remind myself of what's at stake. Losing control would only give them what they want, a reason to dismiss me. But staying composed, that's how I take the power back." David nodded slowly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. Eliza could see he wasn't entirely convinced, but she also knew that understanding came with time and experience. For now, she hoped her example would be enough. The door to the conference room opened, and a small group of executives filed in, their tailored suits and polished shoes a testament to the airline's stature. They greeted Eliza with a mix of deference and familiarity, each one acutely aware of her influence within the company. As they took their seats, Eliza shifted gears, focusing her energy on the task at hand. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "Before we dive into today's agenda, I want to address an incident that occurred in the lounge earlier." The executives exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Eliza didn't wait for questions. She recounted the events with precision, her words painting a vivid picture of what had transpired. She didn't sugarcoat the details, nor did she shy away from the uncomfortable truths about bias and discrimination. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. The executives avoided her gaze, their discomfort palpable. Finally, one of them, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, spoke up. "Miss Barton, he began, his tone cautious. I want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously. Incidents like this are unacceptable, and we'll do everything in our power to prevent them from happening again. Eliza's gaze sharpened. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Harris, she said. But concern alone isn't enough. We need action, real, measurable changes that address the root of the problem. That means reevaluating our training programs, our hiring practices, and the culture we're fostering within this company. Another executive, a younger woman with bright eyes and a determined expression, nodded in agreement. She's right, the woman said. If we want to be a leader in this industry, we need to set an example. This isn't just about avoiding bad PR. It's about doing the right thing. The discussion gained momentum, with ideas and proposals being exchanged. Eliza listened intently, offering her insights and pushing for accountability at every turn. By the time the meeting ended, a comprehensive plan was in place, with clear goals and timelines for implementation. As the executives filed out, Eliza remained seated, her hands resting on the tablet in front of her. David lingered by her side, his earlier tension replaced by a quiet determination. That was impressive, he said. You didn't just address the problem. You turned it into an opportunity. Eliza gave him a small, weary smile. Opportunities don't always present themselves, she said. Sometimes you have to create them. Before David could respond, the door opened again. To Eliza's surprise, it was Mr. Harding, the manager from the lounge. He stepped inside hesitantly, his expression a mix of apprehension and resolve. Miss Barton, he said, his voice tentative. May I speak with you for a moment? Eliza gestured for him to sit. Harding took a seat across from her, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I wanted to thank you, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves, for how you handled the situation earlier. It made me realize how much more we need to do, not just as a company, but as individuals. Eliza regarded him carefully, searching for sincerity. And what do you plan to do about it? She asked. Harding hesitated, then straightened his posture. I've already spoken to my team. We're going to implement immediate changes, starting with mandatory training for all staff. And I've personally committed to educating myself more about these issues. I don't want to be complicit in perpetuating the kind of culture that allowed this to happen. Eliza nodded slowly, her gaze softening. Acknowledging the problem is the first step, she said. But remember, change isn't a one-time effort. It's a continuous process. Stay committed, and make sure your actions match your words. Harding nodded earnestly, his expression filled with resolve. I will, he said. Thank you, Miss Barton. As he left the room, Eliza leaned back in her chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to face, more barriers to break. But today, she had taken a step forward, and for now, that was enough. David glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. You really do create opportunities, he said. Eliza allowed herself a rare moment of levity, her smile widening slightly. Someone has to, she said. And with that, she gathered her things, ready to face whatever came next. Eliza left the conference room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. The day had already been a marathon of confrontation and resolution, yet she knew it wasn't over. Her instincts, sharp from years of navigating both boardrooms and bias, told her that the storm hadn't fully passed. She had seen the flicker of defiance in Susan's eyes, the way her shoulders squared even in retreat. People like Susan didn't fade quietly into the background. They plotted their next move. David walked beside her, his tablet tucked under one arm, his posture more relaxed now that the meeting had gone well. Miss Barton, he said, his tone lighter. Your schedule for the rest of the day is clear. Do you want to review tomorrow's itinerary? Eliza glanced at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. Not yet, David. Let's take a moment to breathe first. David nodded, though he kept his pace brisk. As they approached the private lounge designated for executives, Eliza appreciated his diligence. It was a trait she had cultivated in herself and admired in others. But as they entered the lounge, she immediately sensed something was off. The room was quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of conversation and soft clatter of dishes was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Eliza's sharp gaze scanned the room, taking in the scene. A group of staff huddled near the bar, whispering in hushed tones. A security guard stood awkwardly by the entrance, his eyes darting between Eliza and a commotion unfolding near the far end of the room. And there she was, Susan. She stood in the middle of the lounge, her voice raised and tinged with venom. Two staff members flanked her, their faces pale with discomfort as they tried unsuccessfully to calm her down. "This is unacceptable," Susan barked, her voice carrying through the room like a whip crack. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm not some nobody you can just dismiss." Eliza's jaw tightened, though her expression remained neutral. She stepped forward, her presence commanding attention even without raising her voice. The staff members froze, their eyes widening as they noticed her approach. Susan, caught up in her tirade, didn't notice at first. "I'll have your jobs for this," Susan continued, her words dripping with entitlement. "This whole place is a disgrace. Letting someone like her." She gestured vaguely toward the staff, but it was clear her words carried a broader implication. "Treat me like this, Susan," Eliza said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. Susan spun around, her face contorting with a mix of surprise and anger. "You," she spat, her tone dripping with disdain. "I should have known you'd show up. Come to gloat, have you?" Eliza took another step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stood tall, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I came to ensure this situation doesn't escalate further," she said calmly. "But it seems you've already taken care of that." Susan's face reddened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Don't patronize me," she snapped. "You think you can just humiliate me and get away with it? I have connections, people who listen to me. Not some power-hungry woman who thinks she owns the world." Eliza raised an eyebrow, her expression cool. "Susan, I don't need to think I own the world. I built a part of it, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished. What I won't tolerate is someone like you undermining the values this company stands for." Susan laughed bitterly, the sound grating against the tense silence of the room. "Values? Is that what you call this? Parading your success around like it makes you better than everyone else?" Eliza's gaze didn't waver. "Success doesn't make anyone better than others," she said. "But how we treat people does." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For a moment, Susan faltered, her bravado cracking under the weight of Eliza's calm conviction. But then, as if grasping for the last shreds of her pride, she straightened her back and sneered. "This isn't over," Susan said, her voice lower but no less venomous. "People like you always push too far, and when you do, you'll fall just as hard." Eliza tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You're welcome to your opinion, Susan," she said. "But if you continue down this path, the only person you'll harm is yourself." Susan stared at her, the words clearly hitting their mark, though she refused to show it. With a final huff, she turned on her heel and stormed toward the exit, the room silent except for the sharp click of her heels against the floor. The staff and security watched her go, their faces a mix of relief and lingering tension. Eliza exhaled softly, her composure unbroken. She turned to the staff members who had been caught in Susan's tirade, offering them a reassuring nod. "You handled yourselves well," she said. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to reach out." The young man closest to her nodded quickly, his face still pale. "Thank you, Miss Barton," he said. "We're sorry you had to deal with that." Eliza shook her head gently. "Don't apologize for someone else's behavior. Just remember, every challenge is an opportunity to show who you are." As the staff dispersed, David approached her, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "Do you think she'll really let this go?" he asked quietly. Eliza's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "People like Susan don't let things go easily," she said. "But that's not my concern. My focus is on building something stronger than their ignorance." David nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. Eliza could sense his unease, but she also knew that some lessons could only be learned through experience. For now, she would continue to lead by example, showing him, and everyone else, that resilience wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about standing tall in its wake. With one last glance at the now quiet lounge, Eliza turned toward the exit, her steps steady and sure. The day wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Justice, after all, wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and Eliza Barton was determined to walk it, no matter how long it took. The tension simmered long after Susan stormed out of the lounge. Eliza felt the lingering stares from the staff and the quiet murmur of voices that resumed once she was out of earshot. She had encountered people like Susan many times before, entitled, unwilling to learn, and dangerously arrogant. But this time, Eliza knew Susan's story wasn't over. There was still a thread of unfinished business. 2 days later, Eliza sat in her office, overlooking the city skyline. The polished glass desk reflected the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and her workspace was as meticulously organized as her thoughts. David entered the room carrying a file folder, his usual air of nervous efficiency present. "Miss Barton," he said, placing the file on her desk, "I've been reviewing some updates regarding Susan." Eliza arched an eyebrow, her attention piqued. "What updates?" David hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "It seems she's been making calls. To board members, to executives. She's claiming that you, well, mistreated her, that you used your position to publicly embarrass her." Eliza leaned back in her chair, her fingers interlacing thoughtfully. "I see," she said calmly. "And how have those calls been received?" David's lips twitched into a small, reluctant smile. "Not the way she hoped. Most of them are well aware of the truth. They've read the incident reports and heard directly from Mr. Harding. If anything, her efforts are making her look worse." Eliza allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, though it was tempered by the weight of the situation. "Susan doesn't strike me as someone who knows when to stop," she said. "But we don't need to stoop to her level. Let's ensure our focus remains on the broader changes we've initiated." David nodded, his admiration for Eliza clear in his eyes. "Understood. And speaking of changes, the diversity and inclusion team wanted me to let you know they've finalized the first round of training materials. They're ready for your review." Eliza's smile widened slightly. "That's good news, David. Let's make sure it's implemented without delay." Later that afternoon, a notification flashed across Eliza's phone. It was an email from a board member, flagged as urgent. She opened it, her eyes narrowing as she read. Susan had taken her grievances public. A blog post, laced with vitriol and baseless accusations, had gone viral. In it, Susan painted herself as the victim, twisting the events of the lounge incident into a narrative of persecution. She accused Eliza of abusing her power and using her position to humiliate her. The post had already attracted a small but vocal following of commenters eager to rally behind Susan's manufactured story. Eliza set the phone down, her expression unreadable. David, seated nearby, noticed the shift in her demeanor. "What is it?" he asked, concern evident in his tone. "Susan," Eliza replied, her voice steady. "She's taken her complaints online." David groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Of course she has. Do you want me to?" "No," Eliza interrupted, her tone firm but calm. "We don't respond emotionally. That's what she wants. We'll handle this the right way." Eliza's approach was deliberate. She instructed her legal team to issue a clear statement, backed by the lounge's security footage and eyewitness accounts, which disproved Susan's claims. At the same time, she used the opportunity to emphasize the airline's commitment to inclusivity and fairness, turning Susan's smear campaign into a platform for positive change. By the end of the week, Susan's attempts to vilify Eliza had backfired spectacularly. The truth had come to light, and Susan's credibility crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. Comments on her blog shifted from sympathy to condemnation, and her so-called supporters distanced themselves. In a final twist of irony, Susan's actions had inadvertently brought more attention to the very initiatives Eliza was championing. The airline's new diversity and inclusion programs gained widespread praise, and Eliza became a figure of inspiration for her unwavering grace under fire. On Friday evening, as the city lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky, Eliza sat in her office, a rare moment of solitude wrapping around her. David entered quietly, a cup of tea in hand. "Thought you could use this," he said with a small smile. Eliza accepted the tea, her gaze thoughtful. "Thank you, David." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you think Susan's learned anything from this?" Eliza took a sip of her tea, her expression contemplative. "I don't know," she admitted. "But it's not my job to change her. My job is to make sure that people like her don't get to dictate how the world works." David nodded, his respect for her growing with every word. "And you've done that. You've shown everyone what leadership looks like." Eliza smiled, a quiet, victorious smile that spoke of battles fought and won. "Leadership isn't about being perfect," she said. "It's about standing firm in your values, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." As she looked out at the city below, Eliza felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and while there would always be more challenges ahead, she knew she was ready to face them. For every Susan in the world, there were countless others who believed in justice, fairness, and progress. And Eliza Barton would continue to lead the charge, one step at a time.